Today at the National Press Club, the CEO of Woodside Energy, Meg O'Neill. Soaring global prices, energy market interventions and new climate policies have shaken up the gas industry. As Australia's largest LNG producer, Woodside sits at the centre of debate on the industry's future. Meg O'Neill with today's Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club for today's Westpac address. My name is Julie Hare and I'm the Education Editor at the Australian Financial Review and a Board Director here at the club. Our guest today is Meg O'Neill, Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of Woodside Energy, and with her address today at the National Press Club. Meg O'Neill has been in the oil and gas industry for 27 years and been CEO of Woodside since 2021, 3 years after she joined the company. Before she joined Woodside, Meg's career took her around the globe as head of ExxonMobil in Africa. She also has held senior leadership roles in ExxonMobil in the Asia Pacific, Norway and Canada, as well as chief advisor to its chairman. She's an engineer by training, and despite her degree in ocean and chemical engineering, she was born in the landlocked state of Colorado. She keeps herself busy by being on the boards of the West Australian Symphony Orchestra, and I'm just going to do a whole lot of acronyms here: APPEA, AMMA, GLX Digital, and the University of Western Australia Business School. It's a rare treat to have her here at the Press Club today. She appears to be a bit media shy or reluctant, with her name having appeared in the AFR, the Australian Financial Review, just once since her CEO tenure, and that was in an opinion piece that she authored. So here she is to face the audience with Australia's best journalists, and we welcome Meg O'Neill. So please follow the conversation on Twitter at PressClubAust or hashtag NPC. Please welcome Meg O'Neill. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for that very warm welcome. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, the Ngunnawal people, and paying my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And I extend that to also acknowledge the First Nations people in all of the communities in Australia and globally where Woodside's operations and activities are based. We are on a journey in our relations with First Nations people. We haven't always gotten it right. That said, we are working to get it right by listening to and learning from First Nations people. For Woodside, a big part of this is working with the traditional owners of Murujuga in northern Western Australia, where our largest Australian operations are based. We are proud to support the World Heritage Listing nomination of Murujuga, along with its commitment to coexistence with industry. Australia is preparing for a vote this year on recognizing Indigenous Australians in the Constitution and establishing a voice to Parliament. Woodside supports the Yes campaign. In my view, this would be an important step forward in reconciliation, a genuine opportunity to bring Australians together. I'd like to acknowledge the distinguished guests in attendance today and thank the National Press Club for hosting this address. It's really a privilege for me to be here today at an institution that has a history of bringing Australians together. On the night of his party's election victory a year ago, Anthony Albanese said that this was his goal as Prime Minister, to bring Australia together. I applaud this, particularly as my country of origin, the United States, is polarized on so many issues. It is only through working together across society, government, and industry that we can solve the big challenges that confront us. And that's why I'm here. Look, it's not every day that a gas CEO turns up at the National Press Club. But I'm here because I realize how fundamental energy supply is to every Australian every day. And I want to be part of an honest conversation about how Australia's energy needs will evolve now and into the future. Our industry has not always done a great job of explaining what we do. And that's really a shame, because what we do is central to the quality of life for Australians, and to the role that Australia plays in our region and in a world that needs to decarbonize. I will talk today about energy security through the energy transition, addressing specifically the role of the gas industry. There's a lot at stake. Australia has bountiful resources to support both renewable and non-renewable energy developments, and the world needs both. If we don't get it right, there is a real risk that energy development will stall and Australia will miss out on the benefits. Those benefits are not just energy supply, but also revenue. We stand with society and government as partners for prosperity. Now, to put that in context, last year, our Australian all-in effective tax rate was 46%. Tax on Woodside's profits flow back to Australian governments. We paid $2.7 billion in Australian taxes and royalties last year. Our shareholders also benefit, and our shareholder base is majority Australian. We are an Australian company, and we pay our way. The challenge, as I see it, is for Australia to use its vast natural gas resources for three interrelated goals. First, to provide affordable and reliable energy for Australians. Secondly, to maintain strategic partnerships and energy security in our region. And third, to progress global decarbonization. Climate change is real, and global action is needed to address it. But we have to be wary of the temptation to focus on just one objective at the expense of the others. I'll talk about all three of these objectives and how they're linked, and I'll discuss how key stakeholders can come together to progress these objectives. I'm going to say up front, I don't have all the answers. No one person or perspective does. But a challenge of this magnitude requires us to find the courage to work together. But first, for those of you who may not know the story of Woodside, we're named after a small town in Victoria, where we were founded in 1954. Our breakthrough came when we were granted a license to explore for oil and gas in the 1960s off the Northwest Shelf, off the northern coast of Western Australia. It was a very risky proposition at the time, but it would lead to the birth of the liquefied natural gas industry for Australia, with development through the 1970s and production starting in the 1980s. Woodside did not achieve this alone. We relied on regional customers and local and global investors and joint venture partners for the capital to fund the development. And we only got there by working alongside Australian governments, local, state, and federal, who could see what this industry might contribute to our nation. LNG producers are forecast to deliver $13.8 billion in receipts to state and federal governments this financial year, according to a recent survey from the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association. These funds help fund crucial services like hospitals and schools. The industry and its supply chain support tens of thousands of jobs, investing billions of dollars, largely in regional communities. And crucially, LNG exports can underpin energy to power local industry and homes. I'll give you an example. The Northwest Shelf project started off with the supply of domestic gas to Western Australian customers in 1984. This was supported by long-term contracts with the state. Reliable gas supply has continued to these local customers ever since, thanks in part to the reservation policy that was established by the Western Australian government in 2006 and is still enforced with rigor as the McGowan government looks to avoid future supply challenges. On the east coast of Australia, the supply of gas from the Bass Strait joint venture, in which Woodside acquired a stake through our merger with BHP Petroleum last year, has been a mainstay of gas supply to eastern Australia since 1969. Now, this merger has expanded our portfolio and extended our global reach, including a significant office in Houston. But Woodside remains a proudly Australian company. We want to develop new projects in Australia across both hydrocarbons and new energy opportunities, but that will only be possible if the policy settings provide the certainty to underpin those long-term investments. So let's discuss the first of those three objectives I outlined earlier: the role of gas in providing affordable and reliable energy for Australians. Last year, 2022, the world experienced what the International Energy Agency has termed the first truly global energy crisis. Australia, for all its vast resources, was not immune. And those who can least afford it have felt it most acutely, sometimes having to choose between food and heating through winter. This should not be happening in Australia. Australians should be able to expect reliable energy. That needs to come from having the right investment climate, rather than arbitrary market intervention, and the right honest conversations between all participants in the energy system. A key part of this conversation relates to future supply. As I said, Woodside only became part of the East Coast gas market with our merger with BHP Petroleum last June. The market was struggling at the time, and gas producers were called upon to provide urgently needed supplies. With the support of the Bass Strait operator, Woodside placed additional volumes into the Victorian and New South Wales markets to support energy stability over winter. By working together, industry and the Australian government have agreed parameters to avoid a near-term shortfall in the East Coast gas market. But we need to take a longer-term view to ensure that new supply will be there to meet anticipated demand. Woodside and other companies are actively considering what we might be able to do to help, from infrastructure that would enable LNG imports to the build-out of gas storage. But we know these investments can only be progressed in concert with government. With the right regulatory framework, solutions like these could come online relatively quickly. The long-term answer is development of new supply to keep energy affordable and reliable as we transition to that lower carbon future. Australia has the resources and the companies willing and able to develop them. But new gas supply and infrastructure cannot just be turned on when a crisis happens. It requires a clear investment framework and regulatory certainty to attract the capital from international markets that is needed for these large-scale projects. And that brings us to the second objective. Australian gas is incredibly important to maintain strategic partnerships which underpin export earnings and access to capital, not to mention regional security. As I've outlined, the development of the Australian gas industry was only possible with support of international investors and customers with an interest in securing their own energy supply. Those same customers and partners are now feeling that interest more keenly than ever after the energy shock of the past year. But they are questioning whether Australia wants their investment. A vocal minority wants to shut down the industry and the jobs and livelihoods that go with it. They have deep pockets and are using both protest action and the courts to create uncertainty and destabilize regulatory processes to frustrate both existing and new projects. We certainly respect every Australian's right to express their opinion, and we absolutely share the commitment to decarbonization, but extremism is not the answer. We need confidence in stable regulatory outcomes, or we risk choking our energy industry, impacting both domestic and international supply. This concerns our regional partners, who depend on current Australian gas projects to help them meet their decarbonization commitments and to keep the lights on in Asian megacities. The Australian government has stated its support for the gas industry and has provided strong reassurances that Australia is not quietly quitting its LNG industry. Woodside is certainly not quietly quitting. We are deliberately delivering. The same partners who invested in our gas projects can provide the capital to develop lower carbon hydrogen and renewable projects, but only if they consider it a secure investment. For Australia to remain an attractive destination for global capital, fiscal and regulatory certainty is paramount. We understand the government needs revenue for the NDIS, revenue for AUKUS, to fund health, education, other services. We are already a big contributor. As the Treasurer acknowledged this week, high export earnings are helping the budget right now. We urge the government, in any changes to the tax framework, to consider the long term and to preserve Australia's ability to attract the next generation of investment, jobs, and energy supply. Overreaching now could risk undermining future revenue. In terms of regulatory certainty, agreement on clear processes and response times for project approvals is essential to unlocking reliable supply. Otherwise, energy investment will find another home, taking jobs and opportunities with it. Australia has a leadership role to play in the energy transition, but not through isolation or alienation from the outside world and from those who can bring the capital to fund the responsible development of major projects. So let's talk about the third objective for Australian gas, progressing global decarbonization. Everybody has a role to play in addressing climate change: governments, companies, individuals. Globally, we are going to need to use all the tools to address climate change while advancing developing economies. Now, you might guess from my name that I'm of Irish heritage. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, but my Nana grew up in a village in County Mayo in Western Ireland. She had no electricity. Her family relied on a peat fire for cooking, heating, and light. Boy, we've come a long way in 2 generations. And we should not be regressing. We should instead be extending access to electricity to the hundreds of millions of people in the developing world who still live without it. To do that, we need new supplies of affordable and reliable energy. But we also need to decarbonize. That's going to require the rapid scale-up of renewables and investment in ongoing gas supply as existing gas fields deplete. Even in its net zero emissions scenario, the International Energy Agency has estimated an average of $365 billion of upstream oil and gas investment is needed every year to 2030, and $171 billion every year thereafter to 2050. When used to generate electricity, natural gas emits around half the life cycle emissions of coal. Gas is a very flexible source of energy and provides stable baseload power. As the Prime Minister has said, it smooths the transition to renewables. Now, you might not know, gas is also an important input for processing critical minerals for things like batteries, solar power, and wind farms. In the years ahead, Australia can lead the world in the adoption of renewable energy. But this will only be possible with reliable, firming power sources. If we don't support investment in new gas supply and infrastructure in Australia, then we're not only limiting the availability of gas as an energy supply, but potentially compromising the scale and pace of our renewable ambition. The government is targeting raising the share of renewables in the electricity grid to 82% by 2030, which is commendable. But that leaves an 18% gap. Natural gas could fill that gap, but it would be a big increase from the 7% of the national electricity market, or NEM, that is currently gas-fired power. Gas will have a role to play in decarbonizing the NEM as coal phases out and to support intermittent renewables. Does our gas industry need to do more to reduce emissions? Yes. Are we working to reduce emissions? Also, yes. We employ engineers, practical, creative, problem-solving people who are prioritizing this challenge. And we employ commercial analysts who are figuring out ways to finance it. We have geologists who have historically explored for new oil and gas reservoirs, who are now looking at how we can safely inject and store carbon dioxide in depleted reservoirs. The IPCC has noted that global rates of carbon capture and storage deployment are currently far below those in modeled pathways limiting global warming to between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. This week, Australia's own Climate Change Authority released a report on the role of carbon sequestration in accelerating Australia's decarbonisation, observing it is an essential tool in the climate action toolkit, and that Australia has significant geological storage capacity both on and offshore. We look forward to working with the government to maximize Australia's sequestration potential, including through carbon capture and storage. Do we understand there needs to be a regulatory framework that tests if we are delivering the required net emissions reduction? Absolutely. The safeguard mechanism was actually first introduced under a coalition government, and now a Labour government has tightened it, which the industry actually has long expected. This was very appropriate. The urgency for global action on climate change has increased. I commend Prime Minister Albanese and Ministers Chris Bowen and Madeleine King for their drive to move the policy debates towards the center and to seek practical outcomes. However, it was a missed opportunity that the coalition was not prepared to deal with the government on this legislation. For Australia to tackle climate change sustainably, it's got to be done in the center and in a way that can endure regardless of who's in power. Otherwise, you ping-pong from government to government, playing to the fringes, with outcomes that do not serve the Australian people well. Just look at the past 10 to 15 years of climate policy in Australia. Of course, in the absence of certainty at a national level, we've seen states implementing complex and often conflicting regulations for emissions reduction, which moves us away from the concept of tackling the lowest cost abatement options first, adding to the cost of doing business, which affects not just energy producers, but also industrial segments and ultimately consumers. In our business decisions, we have factored in a carbon price for many years, and we're using a range of levers to manage our own emissions. Avoiding and reducing emissions is first priority, including through technologies to modify our operations. Offsetting emissions by retiring carbon credits also has an important role. And we are working on new and lower carbon solutions to meet our customers' energy needs. Woodside is aiming to spend $5 billion by 2030 to progress new energy opportunities and lower carbon solutions. And I've issued the challenge to our team that we would like to spend more than that, provided the supply chain and the market is there. We're seeing some very positive signals out of the USA. The Inflation Reduction Act is an absolute game changer for a range of reasons. It uses carrots, not sticks, to encourage decarbonization. It focuses on reducing carbon rather than picking winners or discounting any particular energy source. It's a pragmatic, outcomes-focused approach that can drive real change and that is realistic about available avenues for reducing emissions, including offering very strong support for carbon capture and storage. If Australia is to compete in this global race to transition to new energy, we need to incentivize investors to take that required risk. Now, despite all of the challenges and the intensity of the debate on these matters, I remain an optimist. There are significant opportunities across both traditional and new energy in Australia and internationally. One great example is the Sunrise joint venture, which comprises representatives from Timor-Leste, Australia, and Japan, who are working together on options to develop this regional gas resource. We're currently developing the Scarborough gas field. We're working to progress opportunities including Browse and new energy projects in Australia and around the world. Across our industry, talented people are looking at that next generation of projects globally to contribute to energy security and decarbonization. As I said at the beginning, no one has all the answers to these challenges, but there is urgency in figuring out how we can work together to solve them. In addition to energy supply, our gas industry provides feedstock for manufacturing of products that are central to our lives. Now, I might be stating the obvious, but if you drove here today, there's a high chance you used a car that used petrol or diesel. But even if you came here in an electric vehicle or rode a bicycle, it is highly likely those vehicles contain plastics that are derived from oil and gas. Same with the toothbrush you used this morning. Same with the packaging that kept your Wheat Bix fresh. Our lunch would have been produced using fertilizers that rely on gas. Without gas, it's not only energy security that's at stake, but also food security. Now, these might seem like fairly obvious observations, but when you consider the vocal minority that is trying to shut our industry down, it really does beg the question of whether these people understand the consequences of what they are asking for. I've been fortunate to work around the world in the energy industry, and I can tell you, no country is better placed to succeed in the energy transition than Australia. We have plenty of natural resources, gas, sun, wind, critical minerals. We have a talented, educated, highly skilled workforce. We're strategically located near customers in Asia. We should be an energy superpower for a decarbonizing world. And if we capture our global potential, we will also deliver solutions here at home. Now, our industry has some pieces of the puzzle. We know what resources are able to be developed. We understand international energy markets and the needs of our customers. We have the know-how to progress these big, complex decarbonization projects. We want to sit down with those who have the other pieces to the puzzle. Governments who oversee policy decisions. Manufacturers who rely on our products. Unions who are advocating for reliable energy to support Australian jobs. A successful path through the energy transition can only be forged by governments, state and federal, working with industry to progress decarbonization whilst protecting the integrity and security of energy supply. If we can agree on our objectives for Australian gas, let's see if we can agree on how to progress them and find the courage to work together to shore up Australia's energy future. Thank you for your time. I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much for your speech. At exactly this time, in 3 weeks' time, Treasurer Jim Chalmers will be standing at the podium addressing the National Press Club, albeit in the Great Hall, and taking questions from journalists. There is speculation that one of his main revenue-raising ideas will be an increase to the petroleum resources rent tax. You spoke about how much Woodside already contributes in taxes and the like, but given the mega profits of the past year, can you give us any good reason why companies like Woodside shouldn't contribute more to the national coffers?
The petroleum resource rent tax, and let me explain it for the audience here, is what I would call a super profits tax that is applied only to the offshore oil and gas industry. And the way the tax concept was designed, it was designed at a point in time where Australia recognized that for investors to make these very significant capital investments to progress new resources, that we needed a certainty in our tax framework. The way the tax is designed, when we've recouped the investment, those very significant billions of dollars of investment that has taken place over multiple decades, then an additional profit tax comes in. And it's worth noting that throughout this period, as long as we have revenue, we're paying the same 30% corporate tax rate as every other corporation in Australia. When we pay out that investment in the projects, an additional 40% is levied, so an effective tax rate of 58%. Woodside is the biggest payer of PRRT in Australia since coming into the Bass Strait joint venture last year. And we're proud of the contribution that we make. And we're proud of the fact that when prices are high, we make a more significant contribution to Australia's coffers. The thing that's important, though, to bear in mind is that we produce a commodity and the price goes up and down over time. And whilst we had a really strong year last year, 3 years ago was a different story where the price for oil and gas fell to record lows. We need to make sure that our investment decisions are resilient throughout the cycle. And what is most important for us actually is fiscal stability, the predictability that the fiscal terms will not change over the life cycle of the investments. The fact that there's temptation to change a tax regime, I certainly understand that. I understand the budgetary pressures that the government is grappling with. The risk that we run, though, is to try to do something in the near term. It's a bit of a Band-Aid, but it's going to cause long-term harm. It's going to cause investments, again, to be under additional pressure, and opportunities that we might pursue to bring new projects to bear here will be under pressure. So our kind of message to the government is what's important for us is hold the course, stay with the framework we have. It's delivering very well for Australians. When we do well, Australia does well.
Okay. Our first question is from Angela McDonald-Smith from the Australian Financial Review.
Hello, Meg. Thanks very much for your address. Great to hear about your reasons for supporting the gas industry so strongly. I've got a question about the market intervention and the impact that has on supply, the future supply of that gas. We've heard from the federal government and the ACCC pretty much rejecting suggestions that it will impact investment and stall new gas supply. I'm wondering how it looks like from your perspective, both in terms of the Bass Strait joint venture, but also across the industry, given you've got your APIA hat on as well here.
One of the things that is really important for us in our business, we take huge risks. We take risks on the resource that we're developing. When we go looking for a field, we don't know what we're going to find. We don't know how big it might be. We invest billions of dollars to take those steps. We recognize that there's volatility in the price of our product, that the price of oil and gas is going to go up and down over time. What we're concerned about with some of the market intervention that's been tabled is that it takes some of the upside away from the producers, creates uncertainty, and that the customers potentially will have leverage to challenge the price at which we're selling the product. It's the only commodity in Australia that's subject to this sort of regulation. And for us to make those continued investments, and I talked about some of them, things like the opportunity to bring LNG into the eastern states to help alleviate some of the supply pressures that we're facing in the near term. Opportunities to invest in longer term supply, and there are fields that are discovered that are undeveloped. Narrabri is probably the best example of a field that's been working through regulatory processes for more than a decade. That gas could be providing energy to customers in New South Wales today if we had the right framework. So I would, again, advocate that the best solution to the challenges we're facing actually is supporting more gas supply. More supply will keep prices down for customers. More supply will keep that gas reliable for the businesses that count on it. And more supply will be part of Australia's decarbonisation pathway.
Thank you. Ben Westcott.
Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. Thank you so much for your speech today. You actually just mentioned then, and you spoke throughout your speech a lot about the need to ensure Australia's LNG supply going forward. And China and Japan have both also voiced their concerns about their long-term supply of gas from Australia. But there's no doubt that Australia's LNG production and exports have only really increased in recent years, and the government has repeatedly said that they're on board with new gas production, and there's no doubt that Australia has plenty of gas in the ground as it is. I mean, isn't it scaremongering to suggest that there might be any real long-term threat to Australia's gas supply?
I think if you look at some of the policies that have been tabled, there's very genuine concern, and customers and governments in Asia have expressed that concern. The mechanism to balance out the East Coast gas market that's very focused on Potentially interrupting LNG contracts is a great example. Instead of interrupting LNG export contracts, supporting supply would be a better outcome for both domestic customers as well as international customers. I think the real opportunity is to have that whole of government approach to ensuring that the regulatory framework, the fiscal framework, enables that new gas supply to progress. You know, we've seen continued challenges in the permitting processes, in regulatory processes. That's only getting more difficult. Look, we fully embrace the fact that we need to have a strong regulator who holds us to account and makes sure that we do our work in a way that protects the safety and health of our employees, our contractors, the communities where we operate, that we're protecting the beautiful natural environment where we do our activities and do our developments. But we've got to have a regulatory framework, and we've got to have a comprehensive view from government that supports that additional gas supply, because our customers genuinely are worried.
Thank you.
Tom Lowry.
Tom Lowry from the ABC. Thank you again for your speech. I just want to follow on from Julie's question actually around the PRRT. I know that you've suggested to the government that the current regime is quite adequate, but there is a broad concern among many in the Australian community that Australians aren't getting a fair return for the sale of gas abroad. Do you think, as a matter of principle, Australians are getting a fair return at present? And specifically, do you expect your Scarborough project will ever pay the PRRT, noting that some big projects like the Gorgon gas project, for example, don't expect to?
Let me speak to our 2022 financial results. So last year, as I said, the International Agency has billed it the year of a first truly global energy crisis. All energy commodities were in short supply. We actually saw global coal use increase as customers got so desperate to have any energy. They moved away from their decarbonization commitments and doubled down on the highest carbon intensity fossil fuel source available, which is coal. So when we look at our results, we did have strong financial years because of the strong international pricing for our commodities. I will note to the domestic audience that the price we received for the gas we sold in Australia was substantially lower than the prices we received internationally. Because we do recognize we need to make sure that the gas we sell here is sold at a price that allows our customers and those businesses to continue to be profitable as well. But with the returns that we had last year, we did a few things. We paid $2.7 billion in tax and royalty to Australian state and federal governments. We paid $2.8 billion to our shareholders, many of whom are Australian mums and dads and probably folks sitting in this room through the dividend. We're investing, and we invested substantial sums of money in the Scarborough project. The Scarborough project is going to deliver revenue to the Australian governments for many decades to come once we start LNG production in 2026. Now, whether or not it pays PRRT will be a matter for the price environment at the time, and it's premature to forecast that. But the impact in terms of GDP growth, export revenue, jobs is indisputable. This will have a huge and very positive impact on both Western Australia and Australia as a whole.
Thank you.
Anna Henderson.
Anna Henderson from SBS and National Indigenous Television. You started your speech declaring Woodside supports the Yes campaign for an Indigenous voice to Parliament. So if the Voice was to recommend the government and executive make changes that would curtail Woodside's operations to protect more than 50,000 years of cultural heritage at Murujuga, the Burrup Peninsula, a position some locals have taken to the United Nations, and if the Voice recommended that the Murujuga rock art work should not be removed from its current position, some traditional owners have likened that to Juukan Gorge 2.0, what would Woodside do?
As I said at the outset, Woodside's been on a journey over our 40 years of operating in Murujuga. And I'll be direct. When we built the Karratha gas plant, which was our first investment there, we did move rock art, and we did it in a way that was culturally sensitive at the time. But in the light of hindsight, it's not something we would repeat. Very clear to affirm that the ongoing developments on the peninsula, the construction of Pluto Train 2 does not involve the relocation of any rock art. And in fact, when we built the Pluto plant, we worked very closely with the traditional custodians to work around some sites that were culturally important for them. And we continue to allow the traditional custodians to visit those sites and have procedures for ensuring they have access and are able to pursue their cultural priorities. Look, we have a very strong working relationship with the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation. We consult and engage extensively with both the corporation as well as individual community members, as well as the elders that represent the history and the lore and the culture of the peoples that live on the Burrup. We execute our work in a way that's very closely influenced and guided by their traditional knowledge. And perhaps the best example of this is the rock art monitoring program that the Western Australia state government has sponsored. Woodside and other industrial proponents are funding, but the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation and their rangers are managing and influencing and steering. So we'll continue to have that very close and robust and active engagement with the traditional custodians and do our best to adapt our activities to manage their sensitivities.
But what engagement would you have with the voice?
Look, the voice is a method for people to communicate to Parliament. I think there's probably room to figure out or room to work out how the voice engages with specific companies around specific activities. The West Australian framework really sets out quite clearly, and the offshore framework as well sets out clearly the consultation processes that we need to pursue with respect to the traditional owners that are close to our existing operations, as well as those who might be affected by our operations. So we'll continue to use those engagements as the primary form of engagement. Look, I think there's work to be done to figure out how the voice would engage with a specific company on a specific matter.
Thank you.
Mike Foley.
Mike Foley from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age newspapers. Thanks for your address, Meg. As you know, 49% of Woodside's shareholders have voted against the company's climate plan, and since then, just earlier this month, Woodside made a statement as part of a coalition of companies calling for the Albanese government to up its climate policy to, commit to action that's consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. So in light of that, can Woodside continue to advocate that increased gas production and consumption for decades to come is a social good if it can't convince its shareholders of that argument? And on top of that, what extra emissions regulation would you say today that Woodside 1.5 degrees?
Well, first off, let me commend the Albanese government for their prompt action to reset Australia's climate ambition. One of their first acts in government was to set a new target for 43% emission reduction by 2030. Woodside, we have our own emission reduction target, which is a 30% reduction in our net equity scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030. That's measured off a slightly different baseline than the government's. The endpoint actually ends up being quite similar. So despite the 43%, 30%, it ends up being quite a similar place. So we commend the Albanese government for their clarity. The safeguard mechanism reform, particularly as initially conceptualized, was one that would get all significant emitters, the 215 emitters covered by the safeguard mechanism, on that pathway to play our part in helping Australia on its decarbonisation journey. So we certainly commend appropriate action. When we look out to the world's energy needs in 2050, and the IPCC, the body of esteemed scientists, thousands of scientists around the globe, they do extensive modeling on what the world's pathway might look like to 2050 to a Paris-compliant scenario. There are over 200 scenarios for what the world's energy mix might look like in 2050 that are compliant with the aims of the Paris Agreement, which is to keep emissions or to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees C with an aspiration to 1.5 degrees C. In some of those cases, gas demand actually grows versus where it is today or versus where it is in 2020. So gas is absolutely going to be part of the mix. Now, we need to take action. We need to do our part to decarbonize our operations. I spoke in my speech about carbon capture and sequestration. CCUS is an incredibly important tool, and we've got to get after that. We collectively have got to get after that. It's got to be a more important tool in our climate action toolkit. So there are a number of things that we need to do, but I think the Albanese government has done very well in terms of setting clarity and giving us a clear roadmap for the next 7 years.
From that, is CCS the only action that Woodside would commit to in terms of further reducing emissions to what it's doing now?
No, it's not. So we've said, as I said,
What would be the other measures, if you could specify?
Yeah, as I've said, we have our commitments, or our commitments to reduce emissions by 30% by 2030. We're looking at a number of things. There are activities we've already taken. We installed a megawatt battery on one of our offshore platforms, the biggest offshore battery ever installed, to reduce our gas consumption in power generation and reduce our emissions offshore. We've made a number of changes to our operating practices, and I was really pleased when I was up at the Karratha gas plant a few months ago and had an operator on the control panel proudly point to the panel and said, "I turned off that power gen to reduce emissions." So we've got cultural practices. We're looking at an opportunity to bring solar power into one of our LNG facilities. That would be a world first. So there are a number of things that we're doing to tackle our own decarbonization. We're looking at offsets. We've got a number of investments in what I call carbon to products. So taking CO2 and instead of sequestering it in the ground, which is an important tool, trying to do something constructive with it to create other products. So we've got some technology investments in that space, and hopefully we'll be able to bring those technologies to the scale stage in the 2020s.
Jess Malcolm.
Jess Malcolm from the Australian newspaper. Thanks for your address. Just one on the code of conduct. Are gas deals still being put on hold due to uncertainty over Labor's reasonable pricing provision? And could that mean Australia is short of gas if deals can't be struck?
So I can only speak for Woodside, and I'll give a bit of background. So when the gas mechanism was introduced last December, it did a couple of things. One was price setting for this year. For Woodside, that didn't particularly affect our business because we had contracted our 2023 sales well in advance to the amount that we target for contracting. And we continue to sell gas in the spot market as available and as customers demand even today. The challenge with the mandatory code of conduct is it creates a fair amount of uncertainty around how the marketplace is going to operate. I'd say that last year we issued an expression of interest process for gas supply in 2024 to 2026. We were 4 times oversubscribed. And we didn't put a price out there. We asked customers to tell us, what is the gas profile you need? What's the price that is workable for you and your business? Because we recognize that our customers have to be competitive. Our customers have to be viable. So there is a very strong functioning gas market out there. The mandatory code of conduct, though, creates a fair amount of uncertainty, and our current contracting processes have been paused. We continue to talk with the customers who were well advanced in those discussions, but they are paused until we have a bit more certainty out of the government around the long-term implications and how this will play out.
And could this lead to a supply issue?
I think it already has. There's other examples in the industry of players saying that they can't progress their investments. There's an investor in Queensland who stopped progress with their project. There's an investor in the Bass Strait who has to secure project financing to be able to progress their project. But if you don't have certainty on the contract and you don't have certainty on the price you're going to get from your gas, no banker is going to give you project financing. So there are projects that have stopped.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dan Jarvis-Bardy, sorry.
Dan Jarvis-Bardy from the West Australian. Thanks for your speech. You talked about the safeguard mechanism in the speech and that the changes the Labor government made were appropriate. There was some research out overnight from Climate Energy Finance which suggested that Woodside and its partners could be on the hook for a bill of $63 billion out to 2050. That research also says that it should prompt the board to reconsider their investment decision in some of the larger projects. Do you think, or will Woodside have to change its thinking or reconsider its investments in any of the projects as a result of its obligations under the change safeguard mechanism?
So I haven't seen the report to which you reference. As I said in my speech, we include a cost of carbon in all of our business analyses. We have a cost of carbon as we evaluate new investment opportunities to make sure that we're really stress testing whether or not that investment is viable in a decarbonization, in a world that is progressing towards more rapid decarbonization. So all of our investments thus far have passed muster. Scarborough was probably the most significant investment, so we took that investment decision in 2021. We did apply a cost of carbon to that investment. So we are making sure that our investments are resilient to a rapidly decarbonizing world.
Our next question is from Ross Greenwood from Sky News, but it's been asked on his behalf by Maurice Riley.
He apologises for not being here. He was very keen to be here. His question is, would a change to the PRRT, I should say an adverse change to the PRRT, as widely flagged in the forthcoming budget, change the economics on where gas will be processed from the US $50 billion Sunrise gas project? Mm-hmm. Could it tip the scale for the gas to be processed in East Timor instead of Australia, or not to be developed at all?
Mm-hmm. Greater Sunrise is a really nice resource. It's about 5 trillion cubic feet of gas in the gas space. That's, call it a medium to large field. Woodside has had it in our portfolio for many, many years because we do think it's got a very bright future. Its development has been slowed down by the complicated position that it has straddling the border between Australia and East Timor. But we're very pleased to see the Albanese government's really keen desire to progress this by appointing Steve Bracks as a special envoy to help figure out how we sort this, this development. The joint venture has committed to revisiting some of our early concept development studies to evaluate the relative costs and merits of taking the gas to Australia versus taking it to East Timor. We'll be looking at a number of different factors: cost, technical risk, execution risk, as we progress that evaluation. Important to the Timorese is understanding the impact to the people of Timor from the 2 different development concepts. So we'll be doing a very robust analysis, and we'll use that to inform our decision-making on Sunrise.
Thank you.
Jane Norman.
Hello, Jane Norman from the ABC. Thanks for your speech today. I had 2 questions, if that's okay, Julie. The first was you mentioned that your customers are genuinely worried about the investment environment. I'm just wondering in what way they're expressing that. Is it in terms of locking in longer term contracts? There's some hesitation there. And since you mentioned the word quiet quitting in your speech, I assume that was a reference to the Japanese chief executive of INPEX, who recently said that Australia's quiet quitting of LNG will have potentially sinister consequences, effectively suggesting that we're vacating the field to powers like Russia and China, which he says will present direct threats to peace, stability and prosperity in the region. I was just after your response to those comments, having obviously acknowledged that you're saying Woodside is not quite quitting. Mm.
Yeah, look, I think our customers, and thank you to the Japanese ambassador who is with us today, have been quite outspoken around the importance of Australian LNG in meeting their energy needs and their decarbonisation goals. If you look at the countries in the region, Korea, Japan, China, all still have heavy reliance on coal. All of those nations have their climate change commitments. Japan and Korea net zero 2050, China net zero 2060. All of them are very upfront about the role that gas will play in helping meet their decarbonisation goals. All of those nations also acknowledge that we need to be investing in new fuels, hydrogen, ammonia, things like that. But it's going to take time to make that transition, and perhaps that's what's missed in much of this debate is the time that's going to be required to transition from the energy system we have today to the energy system that we want in 2050, which is a net zero energy system. For scale, the world uses more than 100 million barrels of oil every single day. Now, a barrel's about the size of this podium. So 100 million of those every single day. By 2050, we want to get that down to somewhere between 25 and 50 if we want to be Paris compliant. That's a huge task. And we're going to have to be investing tremendous sums of money to grow other energy sources, renewables, solar, wind, things like hydrogen, ammonia. The transition's going to take time, and we're committed to playing our part in it. But the nations that rely on our LNG today are going to need that LNG for decades to come as they work through their own decarbonisation journeys.
All right, thanks.
Poppy Johnson.
Hi, thanks for your speech. Poppy Johnston from AAP. On talk of changes to tax settings for oil and gas companies, have you received assurance from the government that you won't be worse off?
We remain actively engaged with the government to communicate the points that I made in my speech today around how the investments that we make, which are billions and billions of dollars of investment and pay out over decades, the thing that is most important to us is fiscal stability. So we continue to work very closely with the government to articulate the long-term impact of any sort of short-term change in the tax code that might improve the budget today, but actually runs the risk of a much more dramatic negative outcome in 10 years' time.
Tim Shaw.
Thanks, Julie. Meg, thanks so much for your speech. Tim Shaw, Director of the National Press Club. President José Ramos Horta of East Timor stood exactly where you are in September here last year, and he said that he's tired of being lectured by other nations in relation to the direction that East Timor takes. I need to talk about truth and transparency. It's alleged that the Australian government and its agencies bugged the cabinet room of the cabinet of that government. Trust is critical in this issue, transparency too, because the President says, you bully us, we're going to go and talk to the Chinese and we'll do what we want to do. How does your organisation, your skill sets and your team help to mediate and to ensure that the transparency and the truth prevails, not only for the people of East Timor, but also to the benefit of governments? You don't run a government, you run a company. What are you going to do to help broker that deal?
Yeah, there's certainly complex history between Australia and East Timor, and I don't profess to be across all the details of that, and I know the lived experience of people like Mr. Ramos Horta is one that carries a lot of he's carried a lot of personal hardship, and he's done tremendous things, and I think we have to give credit where credit is due for where the nation has come in 20 years of independence. The opportunity for us, and I've been really clear, my first town hall briefing as CEO, I said 3 values are important to me as a leader: trust, transparency, and courage. We need to be approaching our partners, and that includes joint venture partners, governments, customers, contractors, employees, with a spirit of openness and a desire to really build a connection on trust. And I think the crux of my speech today was actually about we need to find a different way to have a really open, honest, and trusting conversation. As we think about how we can work together to develop Greater Sunrise, it really is going to be on that foundation. We've committed to revisiting the Concept Select study. We'll look at all dimensions. We'll look at the economics. We'll look at the cost, but we'll also look at the social impact. And then we'll work as a joint venture with the 2 governments involved to figure out what's the best path forward. It's not going to be an easy path. It's a complex development. It's quite costly. So the solution's going to be quite complex, but we're committed to doing our part in being as open, honest, transparent, and courageous as we can to make that opportunity come to life.
Thank you very much.
Deb Nesbitt.
Hi, Meg. Deb Nesbitt. I work for Bloomberg Law. Right now, as you know, Treasury is looking into climate-related financial disclosures, and that includes Scope 3 emissions. The lack of a Scope 3 emissions target in your climate change report last year, I understand, was one of the kind of key elements of the very significant vote against the climate change report at your AGM. Now, your current report still doesn't have a target. It's got a strategy, but not a Scope 3 emissions target. I'm just wondering why not, and how you think shareholders are going to react this year. Do you think you've done enough to satisfy their clear demands for more, either a stronger strategy or more data, more disclosure?
Scope 3 is complex, and for those who are not deep across the subject, Scope 3 is the emissions that are created by other people when they use our product. So for oil and gas, for example, Scope 3 is created when a customer burns the gas that we produce or uses the oil in a vehicle. In mining, for example, Scope 3 in iron ore is used when that iron ore is made into steel. So there's a lot of industries in Australia where the emissions impact is much more significant in the Scope 3 space than in the Scope 1 and 2 space. In an oil and gas setting, we've done a lot of benchmarking to understand what others do in this space. There are some who have set Scope 3 emissions intensity target. And they can get to that by shifting their portfolio from one that has a lot of oil to one that already has a lot of gas. Woodside already has a lot of gas in our portfolio. We feel like the best thing we can do to really help the Scope 3 challenge is to start producing some of those products that, when they're consumed, have no carbon emissions. Those are things like hydrogen and ammonia. And we're working very hard on these projects. I think what our shareholders are wanting to see is to see our commitment to delivering on those investments. And I'm really pleased that our first hydrogen project, we are hoping to take an investment decision on this year. It's a hydrogen project in the US. The Inflation Reduction Act actually significantly helps the economics of this opportunity. And we want to show industry leadership in this space. And I think once we show our shareholders that we are serious about investing in this space, that they will feel a bit more satisfied around our Scope 3 target. But look, the reality is it's a complex conversation. It's one where we talk actively to many of our shareholders. We will continue to talk actively to our shareholders because we want to make sure we deeply understand their concerns around climate and our climate approach.
Are you worrying about what's going to happen at the AGM next week? There is a really concerted campaign around climate. There's several resolutions there.
So our AGM is an opportunity for us to engage actively with our shareholders, and we look forward to that conversation. I'm sure there'll be people asking questions that challenge the thesis of what we do, and we look forward to having those discussions. It's probably worth saying, I'm really proud of what we do, and I hope our employees are proud of what they do, because we are providing energy that literally keeps the lights on. It keeps homes warm. It keeps lights on in mega cities in Asia. It keeps our important partner nations powered. So I'm very proud of what we do, and I look forward to having that conversation with our shareholders in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
David Denholm. Gentlemen.
Thank you. From Preview magazine, which you might be interested to know is the Australian Society of Exploration Geophysics. One thing you did not outline was the programme by Woodside for exploration in the next 10 years or so. And as you know, investment in that has stagnated. And there's more exploration now onshore than offshore. So what is the plan for Woodside?
As part of the merger with BHP Petroleum, we brought together two really fantastic teams and two teams with quite different perspectives on how to grow the business. The exploration business is being run out of our Houston office by a team that's been very invested in using this technology to help grow the business. That said, with the combined business, we've made sure that we're investing in exploration, I'd say, in an appropriate way for the size of the company. We want to make sure that we're not taking undue risk. We want to make sure with our exploration program that we're focused on opportunities that will be rapid to commercialize. Unfortunately, our industry, we have, and we have it in our own portfolio, assets that were discovered decades ago that we're still trying to figure out how to develop. So we've got to get better at that pathway to commercialization. But exploration is a tool to help regenerate the portfolio and bring new opportunities into the business.
And our final question is from Morris Riley.
Just by way of a declaration of interest, I have received a lot of dividends from Woodside. Thank you. I'm also a long-term supporter of the North Melbourne Football Club, and my question is going to be about the Fremantle Football Club. I noticed in your speech a resilience that people are using some of your sponsorships and philanthropic sort of endeavours against you, and I just wonder whether the Fremantle Football Club should be looking optimistic in the future about your continuing relationship, and if not, I can contact North Melbourne Football Club.
It's a funny topic, actually, because I had a Fremantle Dockers T-shirt on this morning at breakfast. I didn't want to risk my suit with breakfast. I am a passionate supporter. Our relationship with the Dockers is a relationship that's founded on common values. We're two proudly Western Australian organisations. We have a common belief. I talked about trust, transparency and courage. I think you see that mirrored in the Dockers' leadership. We support inclusion and diversity and have worked very closely with them. We're very proud that we sponsored the Women's Club the first year of inception and through to today. We've worked closely with the Dockers on Indigenous reconciliation. I think they're a leader in the league on support for Indigenous players, and we've worked with them to build a reconciliation action plan. So the relationship is more than logos on jumpers. It goes to one of shared values. We've been with the club for more than a decade. You know, we hope to be around to see both the men and women's teams hoist a trophy.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.